You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am very excited. I'm bringing you another artist interview. My guest today is a UK-based artist, and I'm so happy we were able to work out the time change once again, because he's coming to me from the future. What are you, like 6 hours ahead of me? Welcome, Pierre Benjamin. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm really very, very humbled by it. So thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate your coming on, and I'm always excited to learn from artists who are better at this than I am. But before we get into the specifics of your art, I always like a good origin story. So I want to start by just understanding your background. I mean, like, how did you come to develop your passion for art? Where did it all begin for you?
So obviously there are a number of things that I would like to mention, obviously, in order to give some context to where I come from. So I have been living in the UK now for the last 24 years. But originally, I was born in the south of France back in 1979. So basically, I am an 80s kid with all the obvious pop reference you can think of. So obviously, in terms of experiences rather that I think would be relevant to my art journey, I would probably first and foremost mention my interest for comic books. So I remember, for instance, in the 80s, going to the local flea market on Sunday morning and hunting down the comic books that were back then mainly French and Belgian, the one I could find. So obviously, just to draw up a few names, which you might be familiar with, obviously I would expect, because they seem to have been, rather international rather than, national. So the first one I would say comes to mind would be Hergé with, The Adventure of Tintin. I know that Spielberg did an adaptation. I think he did rather well because it's a huge endeavor to put on the screen. And then obviously the Asterix, which I know has been adapted a lot into films, but I don't know if they made it in the US as adaptation. Have you seen any of those or not?
To be honest, I was not much of a comic books person growing up. Like I read the Simpsons comics, and I basically loved the Simpsons TV show and any Simpsons stuff I could get my hands on. I've done a little bit of like research on Jack Kirby, the comic artist, but I'm not that familiar with most comic books, especially like international ones. I've heard of Tintin. I've familiar with the Adventures of Tintin, but not the others. So as you were growing up, you said you loved the comics. Was that your entry point into art? Was that where you started to learn to draw? Or was that more like, were you copying the illustrations that you saw and loving to do that? Did you start making your own comics, or was that just more your reading material?
I'd say it's more in terms of reading material. Yes, I would say mainly for that, because I didn't really start to draw out of trying to copy the comic books. What I also think is worth mentioning in terms of my entry to art is the fact that my father was a photographer. So obviously he did a lot of commissioned portraits and weddings and you name it. So he had a shop in the local town near the village where we used to live. And so people would come up with a lot of films and he would just process them. So first in black and white, and then, all the color arrived in the 80s. So I just, obviously grew up surrounded by photographs. Obviously I had a camera because it was just really convenient. It always had spare ones and I could get all of my films processed for free, which at the time was convenient in order to collect all the references. So I think it was a bit of a luxury, obviously, at the time, because not every kid had this opportunity. But also what he was doing on the side of the photograph is that he was renting VHS films in the side of his shop. So I would get to watch a lot of Looney Tunes cartoons on VHS, and then obviously a lot of other kind of things like comical comedy, rather in that case, rather than sci-fi. But yes, I suppose something else that I remember back then, which I think would be relevant to mention, is I remember there was like a town nearby which had a cinema, and I went to see Who Framed Roger Rabbit in, I think it was 98, it came out. And I thought that was kind of groundbreaking. I mean, I know obviously it wasn't the first time that, it was done to mix live action footage in with traditional animation. But I think the way it was done, the way the characters interacted, it felt very seamless in the way they kind of, blended together. So I thought that was something that really inspired me, and I just found it really magical. And then I'd say the third element would be the fact that my grandfather on my mom's side was a painter, as well as the costume. He was doing costume design and set design for French theaters. So, in his house, I remember there was loads of maquettes. He was making all of these plays. So they were traditional French, 1790, I think it was 1800s plays from Molière and so on. So I remember we would see the maquette, in his kind of studio, and then we would go and see the plays, and you see the bigger picture, the adaptation of his costumes, etc. So that was obviously something I found really inspiring. And obviously, he was a painter, at heart. So he started off in 1945, right after the war ended in Europe. So he started as in the fine art school in Paris. So, from probably about 1947 to 2017, about 70 years worth of, kind of exhibition across France and Europe, made me kind of really, really inspired. And I always followed, his work really closely. So he managed to sell a lot of his artwork in the US, thanks to my great uncle, who was also at the time lecturing in the Yale University in the US. So interestingly enough, he was also linked to Victor Hugo descent, who was called Jean Hugo. So I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
I do know Victor Hugo. That's a name that I recognize.
Exactly. So there was a link there. So Victor Hugo, I think his great-grandson, I will have to verify that, Jean Hugo, was, a painter, local painter at the time in the south of France. And so he would, send letters to my great-uncle asking him to go into New York and get all of the right pigments. So I think he was using a technique which involves egg yolk, I believe. You probably know that more than I do.
Oh, like a tempera? Like an egg yolk tempera?
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Interesting. So really you come from a pretty rich artistic background. And growing up with a father as a photographer, I mean, you've already said that, it was nice for you to have access to photography and development, because I also was a child of the 1980s and 90s, and I vividly remember the difficulty of getting stuff developed and waiting to find out how awful all my photographs were. But what I find interesting there is, when I've looked at your paintings, the composition has almost like a photographic snapshot kind of feel in some of, you know what I'm saying? Like, do you find that has affected your lens for composition as well?
Totally. Yes, I would say very much. Yes. I mean, obviously with my dad, he would go to exhibitions and look at other artists, and he would have really a lot of books, a lot of, classic photographers. So the one I would remember out of all of them, which still to this date I found inspirational in terms of composition, is Henri Cartier-Bresson, which I think you probably know of. Cartier-Bresson, maybe no.
The name sounds familiar, but if I'm being 100% honest, I can't picture in my head right now the work. It's like one of those, like, I've read it in a book and not clicked the connection yet.
So yes, totally. I mean, it's just magical. It's worth looking up on Google. I'm sure you'll recognize the photographs. They're all in black and white, mainly located in Paris. And he managed to capture these kind of really beautiful, kind of, interesting, idealized lifestyle of Paris in probably, the post-war. So it's interesting. And I do look a lot at composition, since, my grandfather was such a classical artist. So he was, painting a lot of landscapes and still lifes and portraits. And, I remember I've got lots of his sketchbooks because, he's no longer with us nowadays. And what I find striking is how he just composed all of his paintings with very simple geometric shapes, which, is a classical, way to build painting anyway. So, yes, I mean, that's embedded in what I do for sure.
And you said your grandfather being a more classically trained painter, did he teach you techniques as well? Like, did you learn directly from him or just from seeing the final product and observing that? So interestingly, he never really was keen on teaching me. So I was probably too young. And he didn't want me to get involved in the world of art because I think he did struggle at the very beginning. So he was obviously doing all the costume design and set design, but he was also lecturing, I think, in a technical school. So he was technical design to, in order to sustain, 5 kids, one of them being my mom. So no, he never really wanted to teach me much, which I found frustrating because I really wanted to, desperately learn from him. But, he's just saw me as a kind of cute grandson that is just interested in art. So, I did a lot of things. So I did some sculptures and you could see that there was, obviously some interest on my end. But yes, no, sadly, he was not my tutor, if you would say that, in that way. But yes, I mean, what I did forget to mention as well is that, there was like, kind of a turning point when I moved to Paris and I went to study in the Louvre. There is like a school, so it's not practical. It's only you study history of art. So I got to study Greek, Egyptian, Roman, and Assyrian antiquities in late 98, 99. And obviously that was, kind of really insightful on, the whole context and why it brought the Renaissance later on and the modern art after. So yes, there is a lot there that, I could always talk about, but I think, we covered everything. Oh, so that's interesting. So you had the formative experiences with the art around the house and, the comic books and the pop culture stuff, but then you also had, your family that you learned from, and then, the Louvre and the incredible collection from antiquity. And that's an interesting blend of different perspectives that I am really looking forward to learning more about. So after a short break, we're going to talk about you and your specific creative process and maybe a bit about how all that comes together. I've got Pierre Benjamin here, a UK-based artist, a painter who's doing some beautiful portraits. I like it because it's kind of a poppy sensibility. And, I think we have a lot of the same cultural touchstones. You said before the break that you liked Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And still, I remember seeing that in the theater and my mind being blown as well. Like you said, it wasn't the first of that sort of genre of mixing live action and animation, but it was the first one that stuck in my head. Now, I do want to get some insights, though, into your work and your practice. So if you're listening on Amazon, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere that supports episode-specific cover art, the image we're talking about is going to be the cover art for this episode. So you can see it there in the player. But can you start off by just describing for me, like, the process for you? What was the inspiration for the piece? How do you go about creating it? Are you a fast painter? Do you do a lot of studies? Do you work directly? Like, just tell me all the things about your work.
Right. So, that specific painting is obviously the result of a lot of various influence, which I haven't really mentioned in great depth. But I'd say the first one I would say is mainly discovering the Blue Note records, vinyls in the early 90s, because one of my uncles was just a massive fan. And I really found, the composition of these records fascinating, how they could have all the fonts, kind of very, kind of modern way. And then have most of the time, I'd say the jazz man or woman, whichever was the case, how he would kind of frame it, really interesting, dynamic way. So I just love, this idea of kind of, musicians jamming and improvising on stage, or just go with the flow. So personally, I play piano and double bass, and I just, find, going out to see concerts is always an inspiration anyway. So in terms of, that's more of a kind of, why did I, go for the musician? But I would say in terms of the actual style, I would say it's mostly looking at what inspired me from, the early 90s. I would say Toulouse-Lautrec, was using kind of dark backgrounds and then really bright colors. Something dynamic, which portrays, again, this kind of party atmosphere reminiscent of the cabaret Parisian lifestyle. So, something dynamic and quite fresh. That's what I kind of was looking for. And obviously, in terms of the instrument, being the banjo, I know it's not a typically European instrument at all. We rarely see that. If when you go out, you see a lot of jazz, a lot of, different rock and, electronic, etc. But this is mainly more of a reference to my love for Leon Decker and Norman Rockwell. Because I believe, just the way they portray the narrative is so efficient, is so clear and simple that, it's very much a kind of a, universal kind of a message. So, the way I did that specific painting, I would say is I do a lot of drawing, so lots of sketches. And once I find, a pose that I like, so obviously I look at a lot of photographs. I just look at something that I think looks appealing in terms of obviously composition. And then I go straight onto the canvas. So I use a red primer to give like kind of a good grip and, kind of a darker tone. Because obviously, the white canvas can be intimidating at times, even though the drawing I tend to kind of trace before I apply my primer. So once, this is out of the way, I kind of, start with the obvious colors. So I like to start with the white values. I know some people like to start with the darker values or the lighter ones, but I tend to start with just some of the highlights, and that gives me a bit of depth already. So I suppose that's probably kind of, the background behind this piece. I hope that makes sense anyway.
No,
But,
I
yeah,
mean, as somebody who loves music and a, terrible musician, but a great lover of music, I fully understand the appeal of the dynamism of a musician as a subject. And so what I'm hearing from you is you started with a photographic reference and you made your drawings. And as I look at the work, I see hints of that primer, that like underpainting going on there. And one of the questions that I would have for you is, are you the type who, do you go like charcoal on there, sketch it out, block in your colors? Do you paint in your contour lines? Do you add the contours as a final detail? Like, are you blocking in color and then adding line, or are you the line first and then blocking in color? You know, like, I don't know, maybe that's just like a nerdy in the weeds question, but that's one of the thoughts that I have. And then I'm also curious, are you working wet on wet? Are you working very like directly? Are you working in layers, letting each layer dry and then coming back? Like you said, you get the highlights. Do you let that dry, or do you work into the wet white paint to get the blending that happens there?
So in fact, I use a mix of techniques because I always find that experimenting is obviously the best way. I would say I tend to, draw the figure onto the canvas with a simple kind of, pencil. So something, about 2, 3, 4, 5B. And then once I've got all of these shapes, what I tend to do is, start with this specific color. Let me just find it right here. I've got it. So I start with the Van Dyke brown, and I kind of, reinforce all the contours of my pencil drawing, adding a little bit of shadows and, obviously putting all of that kind of darker values. And then once I've got that established, this is where I paint, my whites, which I mentioned. But yes, I like to work fast. And so in that case, obviously, I do use the wet on wet technique that you mentioned. And I find that oil, since I switched to oil, because I was mainly painting with acrylic for years, I find that it gives me so much more that you could never do with acrylic. Just the way it blends in when it's wet is absolutely mesmerizing. So yes, I think it's probably the best, kind of a medium that I found. I've tried, other techniques, but yes, definitely that's my most, kind of the one that I use the most.
So I'm looking at like, I'm full disclosure, I'm like zooming into the details to look at the brush strokes here. And one of the things that's striking me is you've got that warmer earth tone, even underneath the blue. And I'm curious about that experience for you, because like I don't know, it looks to me like your blue in the background looks to me like maybe a Prussian. Is that maybe a little bit of almost like a cerulean in some of those spots, or is that white with the Prussian? But it's a deep, gorgeous blue, and I like the spotlight effect that we've got there. But I'm wondering how that fights against, like how you keep it from getting muddy as it's going over, a brown.
So what you do see, as a kind of a brown, is basically my red primer. So I use, a primer from Michael Harding, and so basically it's called Pozzuoli Red Earth, so it's semi-transparent. So this is kind of, what you see is the primer, really, like that red warm color. And yeah. I get that obviously from Toulouse-Lautrec, or my grandfather who used that technique, and always struck me whenever I was looking at it. And now that the primer is always dry, because the primer is acrylic based, so it dries within seconds.
Okay.
So that gives me like I'll send you some kind of, if you go onto my social media, I share a lot of time lapses where you can see the process from start to finish. So you'll be able to see how I kind of, use this color. But yes, you're right. The blue is the Prussian blue, and I use warm white from Michael Harding in order to kind of, tone that down without it to be too cold. So titanium white I rarely use nowadays.
Mm-hmm. So, and for listeners who want to see the social media and time lapses, look in the show notes. I'm going to include links so you can see Instagram and TikTok and, your website and all the places where you can see the work and even a peek behind the curtain of how the work is made. But I think that's interesting. So you're letting that primer dry before you put the blue over, and then just however many coats it takes to get the richness, the opaque blending that you need. Are you doing are you doing the figure first and then the background around it, or are you doing the background and then the figure? Well, you have already said you start with the whites to block that in. So I guess it's probably figure first, right?
Yes. Yeah, totally. So something I forgot to mention as well is that I mix all of my oil paint with beeswax paste, again from Michael Harding, and then some Miracle Medium, which is basically linseed oil. So I get this kind of, very buttery texture, which is quite thick. And yes, as you understood right, I start with my figure and the background comes last most often. And so the background here wasn't really part of the plan. I tend not to improvise a lot on canvas as much as I used to, because I've done 100 of paintings, which I rather not show because I don't think they're that successful, but it was part of my journey. So in terms of figure, I'm very definite about, what happens with it. The background, I'm happy to just see how it flows with the colors. So I wasn't really planning to use a blue for the background, but I love blue. So no matter what, I always go back to it. It's more of an obsession.
Well, you, in my opinion, you cannot go wrong with a good Prussian blue. And I think the coolness of that creates a good contrast with the warmer figure. I mean, it works. It's eye-catching. Like if we think of like that poppy sort of background and influence that I personally absolutely love, there is something really nice about the energy that's created by the contrast of the warm and cool, but also, when we talk about the dynamism of musicians, the angles in this composition, the expression, all of that, I think is really interesting. But the other thing that sort of perked my ear there as you said this was, you're very careful about and very meticulous on your rendering of the figure, but then it sounds like the background is where you allow the spontaneity in the piece.
I would say so, yes. Faces I find always really fascinating. And, I do, so I try to paint every day, really. And some days it feels like, everything goes very smoothly. And I do a lot of likenesses, as you will see on my website. I try to kind of keep that as a kind of a challenge and a good exercise. But yes, often faces are a struggle because, everyone's face got different form, and just depending on the light, the skin tones I do struggle with because everyone's got different pigments, obviously. It's always, a bit of, you just don't know exactly what the piece will end up looking like, but it's, it's part of the journey, I would say.
So there's the figure that you worry over, and then the background is where you allow yourself to relax.
I'd say so, yes. Once I'm happy with, the pose and kind of how everything is coming together. So obviously that's something I wanted to mention later, but, to me, character design is mostly about silhouettes. So when I draw, I look mainly at the negative spaces, and, that's something that only clicked later on in my life. So if you look at the silhouette of the character, you can see it's very, established. So I use the lighter value to make it pop.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that was one of the things that I don't know, it feels maybe like a photographic influence to me in terms of the composition, just like the play off the positive and negative space in there. That's one of the things that I really liked about this particular painting and this composition is the way that the figure balances, I guess, with the blues in the negative space. I think it's a nice work, and I also find it like so interesting that you reference Lautrec. I think that name's come up a couple of times because there is this feel in terms of, the way that I can see the underpainting through in some areas with like, the primer coming through the green of the clothing or in the contours, but also the way that, some of his works have that feel of like the face, the primary focal point, is so rendered, and then things almost dissolve in the background. And I that's always appealed to me. Like Lautrec is one of those artists who was my sort of entry point into the art world. You know, like Lautrec and Van Gogh, like those were the artists that I looked at when I was a teenager and going to the museum. You know, those were the ones that held my attention because there's a tension there. And there's something interesting to me about that tension between the studied and meticulously rendered and then the relaxed, and the balance between those. You have to get it just right. And that it feels to me like watching someone walk a tightrope, you know, and that's exciting to me when I look at a work of art.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I remember going to Toulouse-Lautrec Museum in the southwest of France, in the city of Albi. If you ever get the opportunity to go, it's fantastic. It looks like the museum is still a work in progress, and they haven't really fully finished it. But yes, some of the pieces in there are fantastic. And then in Paris, if you get the opportunity to go to Orsay, and you probably have, you know, it has some striking, really interesting pieces that he made. So yeah, I just found his style quite different from you know, let's say Monet. And I mean, Monet, you could argue that with the water lilies, there is also a lot of layering and undercoats that appears, and you can see what's underneath. So maybe you know, there were some influences coming through. But yes, I just, you know, I relate to you and what you said.
Well, I would say it is tremendously validating to hear that I'm getting something right from the artist himself. So I'm gonna quit while I'm ahead. We're gonna take a short break, and then we're gonna wrap things up a little bit with your advice and insights for anyone else who wants to be a more thoughtful creator and consumer of the arts. Now back with Pierre Benjamin. Once again, I would tell listeners, check out all the links in the show notes, see the work. But whenever I have the privilege of getting to talk to an artist, I always want to wrap things up by getting some thoughts and insights, you know, the benefit of your wisdom and experience. What tips would you give aspiring artists, or just those who want to be more thoughtful consumers of the art? Like, what do we look for as the marks of a good work?
So in terms of, you know, an artist that is starting out, I can relate a lot to this because I teach in university and I have a lot of newcomers every year. You know, we have more students now than we've ever had, so it's always a good thing. But I would say, you know, having the constructive criticism around you is so beneficial. So taking feedback is not an easy thing to do, but if you start listening to what people say about your work, it makes you question and just make you think what could be improved. So what I do find is that often, you know, and I think I was, you know, very much like that as a young teenager. You know, you don't take criticism very easily, and you find offended because you think that whatever you created is the best artwork you could. But really, there is a long journey, you know, and that's why I went to museum and I was looking around. You know, especially my grandfather looking at these drawings, and I was thinking, wow, there is a lot of observational skills which I still miss because, you know, I still need to learn how to draw faces and feet and hands, and they are so challenging, whatever direction, you know, let's say scenario you have in front of you. So I would say, yes, you know, learning to draw from life is also the most difficult, and that's something that should always be, addressed. So if you are just wanting to learn, you know, the drawing is the base. So I remember when my grandfather was telling me, he said, if you want to look at the quality of a good figurative painter, first of all, look at his drawings. So a good example was Picasso. And the second example, I would say Ingres. So Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And I found this drawing fascinating. So I remember I bought a book late 90s, and it was basically a compilation of most of the drawing by Ingres. And it was huge. It was just like, it weighed a ton. And, you just see how much study there is in order to make something successful. So yes, I would say, don't be afraid to make mistakes and learn from them, and just to produce a lot, because eventually you'll see the journey that you've been through is quite phenomenal. You don't realize as you go along, but you do change. So in terms of what I think collectors should be looking at is obviously yes, I'd say the variety as well. I really like artists, for instance, Picasso was one of them, or Monet is another one, which I admire, because I find that they went, from the super abstract, if you think the water lilies, which I mentioned, it feels like a very abstract piece. And if you look at his early works, very figurative, and likewise with Picasso. So I suppose, to me, if you are able to have a body of, work that shows variety and good observational skills, then that's a win situation.
The one thing there that I found really interesting, and I found myself thinking about, is, as you said, one of the first things you said was being able to accept criticism. And I know, like, for myself, whatever I have just completed, I always feel like is the best thing I've ever completed. It's like I'm always the most excited about whatever I've just created. But I also think about, as I've studied so many different artists in the course of creating this show, and I feel like there are so many success stories where the artist was doing something that everyone said was a terrible idea. Monet was starting off doing the caricatures, and then he was painting these blurry pieces in plein air, and it was rejected by the Salon. And we've got the Salon de Refusés, and I'm sorry for the pronunciation as I'm talking to a native French speaker. I see you laugh, and I appreciate that you've got the good nature about it. But the thing is, how do you know what criticism you need to take in and really consider, and when do you stick to your vision even if other people don't get it yet? It's a hard thing. Like, for me, the thing I have always found the surest sign that I'm wrong about something and need to take in the criticism is when I have like a really strong emotional reaction against the criticism. When I feel myself dug in and I'm like, there's that has to be wrong. And I have like no actual reason I can articulate why it must be wrong. It's like, I'm wrong. I just haven't gone through the stages of grieving yet. But I'm curious, for you, how do you decide, how do you evaluate what criticism has a point to it, and maybe you need to take it in, and what criticism do you let roll off your back?
It's a really, really tricky thing. Obviously, what I remember hearing is that, back in the fine art schools in the UK in the, kind of 80s and early 90s, the way they would do crits, in the fine art school, is that they would literally take someone off the street, a passerby who had obviously time to spare, and say, just say, would you be able to come into the art school and just give us some kind of feedback on the students' work? So someone out of nowhere would come and, come with this kind of, you could call it totally irrelevant, because, as artists, we think that only someone who's got an understanding of the art history and, how you're being influenced and how you're referencing other artists. So I find that nowadays we don't, do this anymore. because I feel that audiences are not ready to take the criticism. So in some ways you could argue that taking someone off the street and just having him to give criticism is not necessarily the best idea. So I'm just happy to really understand or to discuss rather what would be the best way to get criticism. Is it going to be someone that has a lot of mileage, or is it going to be someone who is more of a newbie? I don't know. I think it's an open debate still. But I personally, whenever I seek for criticism, I ask people around me, and because my grandfather was always around, and he was obviously the benchmark. I feel the criticism I get from my family, my relatives, is very harsh, and I think it's great. So I'm always kind of in the shadow of my grandfather, which it can be a huge challenge. But I'd say most people would say, oh, don't take criticism from your parents because they will never want to offend you. But I think it's wrong, because the way my mom criticizes my work is so harsh that I feel that she's actually the best critic, because her dad was, really serious professional artist. So I think she's got an understanding of color and light and composition and how it all kind of makes a successful piece. So I don't know. I think it's an open debate. We could talk about it for a long time, couldn't we?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So your thought is consider the source. If you feel like the source really knows their stuff, then you've got to take it more seriously. That's interesting to me, because I actually thought it was a fascinating idea to go for the person off the street and feel like, if the person off the street gets your work, then you're communicating effectively. And if they don't, then it's too esoteric. And, maybe you need to get out of the rarefied air of the institutions and realize what really resonates with a wider audience. But maybe that's just like my populist inclinations, as I am desperately hoping that my thoughts will resonate with a wide audience. And if you want to help me on that journey, 5 stars on Apple and Spotify would be much appreciated. But either way, I think that's interesting to consider. And like you say, it's a debate that there is not a clear right or wrong. People could weigh in either way with valid opinions about whether you should be looking at the source as, I want to hear from the experts who can put it in line with other theory and criticism from the ages, or I want something that's more accessible to anyone and everyone.
There was something as well. I remember posting a lot of artwork online. And so I do a lot. I teach game art in university. So I do a lot of 3D work. So I'm mainly kind of, on computers all day, if you see, sorting out technical problems for students. So that's why when I come home, I want to go back to traditional and just have a brush and, good kind of pigment. And just, I want to go back to the basic. This is really what I find so refreshing. Because, when you're on Photoshop or any other software, the undo button is such a luxury, but you don't get that as much. If you do, let's say, layer it too thick, you're going to have to wipe it all. And, it is more challenging, I think, to go back to this. But what I remember is that people out of nowhere online, keyboard warriors would come out and really lash out on you. But I think mainly because probably they were having a bad day at the time. And I thought, well, I won't get it I don't want to get offended by someone that is probably not in the right kind of place in that specific day. So I never really, took harsh criticism too personally, because otherwise, it is kind of, you end up being depressed, I think, if you do take it seriously. So, yeah, I try to kind of see the context of someone as well who is coming to criticize the work.
Oh, that is a really good point, because, the internet has put, the person on the street and their opinions so widely out there, but it's also become, in some ways, a place where people feel like they can just hurl insults without realizing there's another actual human being on the other side of that, because, you know, the online critique is so different from the face-to-face critique. And, you know, I think we could always benefit from a reminder of the humanity behind, you know, the arts. And, you know, I define art as the product of human creativity. And, you know, I think that's why these paintings and things that have the flaws and, you know, whatever, the telltale marks of handmade work is something that people, I personally find myself really appreciating in a work. And that's why I like that, like you said, that tactile sense, the physical media it's just different from a digital piece, because you have to work with it differently. And I feel like audiences respond to it differently. But you're right, that is a good point about how the online critics almost use it as a vehicle for laying out their own displeasure at a number of things that may be unrelated to you as an artist. And I think aspiring artists need to be mindful of that as they put their work out there. And I would hope that anyone who has listened to my show would also know, like, just be nice. Don't be a jerk, in the great words of Barbara Kruger. You know, when people are putting stuff out there, whether it is a beautiful painting or a thoroughly adequate podcast, you know, kindness matters. And that's probably a good note to end on. So I'm going to say once again, thank you so much, Pierre Benjamin. I really appreciate your sharing your time and your expertise and your insights into the creative process.
Thank you. Thank you again.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.